Greetings in the name of Jesus the Christ. I'm Paula Cook, the pastor at Millersburg United Methodist Church. Thanks for joining me today on Midweek Boost. As we began talking last week about the book of Nehemiah, we determined that Nehemiah was a man who saw the situation that was taking place in Jerusalem. He spoke to God. Literally, he spent time fasting and praying and crying out to God about it, and then he was ready to respond. Well, here in Nehemiah, the second chapter, we discover that Nehemiah is now ready to move forward because in that time of crying out to God, in that period of fasting and praying and seeking God's face, which was 4 months, in that time period, God helped him to begin to develop a plan. And so what we see in chapter 2 is that Nehemiah is ready to move forward in what God has called him to do. And Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, as we find out at the end of chapter 1. Well, now, here we are in chapter 2, and Nehemiah has come into the presence of the king. And the king sees that Nehemiah is upset. And the king says to him, after seeing him concerned, the king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it." My friends, here is Nehemiah. God has given him a plan, and yet in the midst of beginning to set forth in that plan that God has given to him, he immediately acknowledges God again. Here Nehemiah is a leader, willing to go to where God has called him to go, but always being aware that it is God who is calling him into this place and to do what he's been called to do. Nehemiah does not move forward in anything unless he speaks to God and acknowledges God in the midst of the plan that is set before them. If you go to the final verse in Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah has been confronted by those who think he's ridiculous. And he says this, "I answered them by saying, 'The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it.'" My friends, Nehemiah is not just a man with a plan. Nehemiah is a man who acknowledges God in the midst of that plan and cries out to God. We as leaders, whether in our schools, our homes, our churches, wherever we find ourselves to be in leadership, we need to be aware of this, that we can be somewhat like Nehemiah. Remember, in chapter 1, we saw that Nehemiah saw the situation. He prayed. He responded. Here in chapter 2, Nehemiah sets forth a plan, and he acknowledges God's presence in the plan. My friends, what is it that you're up against, or what are you facing right now? I encourage you to cry out to God just as Nehemiah did, and then know that when the timing is right, God will help you to move forward in whatever it is that he has called you to do in the midst of your life. I would encourage you to be a leader like Nehemiah, acknowledging God in every part of your life and setting forth the plan that God has given to you as God leads you. Have a great day, and join me again next week for Midweek Boost, when we will look at Nehemiah, the 3rd chapter, and see some really interesting things as we look together at Nehemiah chapter 3. Have a great week.